Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the #1 gangster of all time. Intelligent, ruthless, and a visionary. Luciano transformed the Mafia from warring street gangs into a highly sophisticated empire. Under Luciano, the Mafia grew to be bigger than General Motors. And by the time he'd finished, the mob was raking in $40 billion a year.
Lucky Luciano is a quintessential American. Using his cunning and his intelligence, rises to a position of fantastic power and wealth.
This is the story of the man who put the organized into organized crime.
One man changed the whole texture and landscape of crime in America. There's no question that Luciano invented the modern mafia.
But where were the law enforcers? Why was nobody able to stop him? On September the 10th, 1931, 4 hitmen came calling at offices above Grand Central Station in New York City. Their target, New York's top mafia boss, Salvatore Maranzano. This execution was a critical moment in the meteoric rise of the biggest gangster in American history. Charles "Lucky" Luciano.
Once in every generation comes along a dynamic criminal genius mind. And the mafia in America was blessed that they had Lucky Luciano.
Luciano had begun his career as a top hitman for New York Mafia Don Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria. Masseria headed the largest Italian gang in the city and ruled the streets in the early 1920s. But in 1925, another boss arrived in town. His name was Salvatore Maranzano, from the infamous mafia town of Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily. And he was eager to seize control of Masseria's empire. When tensions mounted between the two leaders, the killings began. The streets of New York turned red. The underworld called it the Castellammarese War. But for one man, all this chaos was the opportunity he was waiting for. Luciano had always been against the bloodbath, arguing that gunfights and bodies were bad for business and attracted too much police attention. Luciano also despised the old ways of his warring boss, Masseria. Luciano wanted to build bridges with Jewish and Irish gangsters. He believed their networks were essential to the success of the Mafia's international businesses. But Masseria was fiercely opposed to any non-Italian partnerships.
People like Masseria hardly spoke English. They couldn't communicate. It was a different generation. And Lucky understood this and they didn't.
After 18 months of fighting, with no end in sight, Maranzano told Luciano that if Masseria was eliminated, he would not take revenge on his men. Luciano shared Maranzano's vision and made him an offer. He would kill his boss, Masseria, if he could take over his gang and become an equal power with Maranzano. Maranzano accepted the deal. Luciano invited Masseria to a lunchtime meeting at one of his favorite restaurants, the Nova Villa Tamaro, in Coney Island, New York. While they played cards, Luciano's hitman waited outside for his signal. With Masseria's murder, Luciano signaled to the underworld that the Castellamarese War was over. Maranzano then called hundreds of gang members from across the country to a meeting in the Bronx to announce his victory.
Now it's going to be different,
he told them, and spelled out his grand plan. The gangs of New York would be organized into 5 families to control the boroughs of the Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and Staten Island. Each family would be headed by a boss with an underboss, and under them would be lieutenants and soldiers. And above them all would be Maranzano himself. And if anyone disagreed, they would be killed.
I'm going to be capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses.
This meant that he would be the leader of all the New York Mafia operations. His speech enraged Luciano. Maranzano had backtracked on his promise of equality, and now Luciano was determined to strike back. Maranzano realized Luciano was a potential threat to his total dominance of the American Mafia. So Maranzano contracted the notorious Irish killer, Vincent Mad Dog Cole, to get rid of Luciano. Cole was a lone, out-of-town hitman for hire and would be perfect for the job. But Luciano learned the details of the plan. Maranzano would call him into his office for a business meeting, and Mad Dog Cole would be waiting there to kill him. For Luciano, it was now a question of kill or be killed. The problem was how to kill Maranzano. He was extremely well protected, never without bodyguards, and always traveled in a bulletproof car. Tax agents and accountants were frequent visitors to Maranzano's offices, and Luciano realized that this was his way in. On the day Luciano was to have his meeting with Maranzano, he would send his hitmen instead, all posing as taxmen. As an extra touch, they would be Jewish, as he knew Maranzano despised them. Luciano then contacted his childhood friend, Meyer Lansky, to arrange the hit. It is said that Lansky then rented a remote house in the Bronx for the 4 killers to prepare for the hit. They were forbidden to leave the house and were provided with all the provisions they required, including women. and through the summer months of 1931, Lansky taught them how to talk, walk, and act like taxmen. Then in September, the call came through. Maranzano told Luciano to come to his office to discuss urgent business. On September the 10th, 1931, Luciano sent the 4 hitmen to Maranzano's offices above Grand Central Station in New York. The gangsters entered his office and drew their knives, a weapon chosen to kill their victim in silence. But Maranzano would not go down without a fight. He took multiple stab wounds to his body, a slashed throat. He was still alive. The killers were forced to do it the noisy way. With the death of Maranzano, Luciano's time had come. At last, Luciano would realize his vision to reach out across America and organize organized crime. One of the first people he turned to was someone he'd known since they were both street kids. Luciano started out by offering protection to Jewish schoolboys targeted by Irish gangs. One day, he squared up to a small boy on his way home.
If you want to keep alive, Jew boy, you gotta pay us 5 cents a week protection money.
The schoolboy stared him in the eye and told him to
Go yourself.
It was Lansky, a young Polish immigrant and the man who Luciano had turned to when he needed hitmen for Maranzano's execution.
From day one, we're talking when they're in their early teens, they knew each other. They were thugs then. But they developed this relationship where they built it into an empire.
Lansky became Luciano's right-hand man and chief business executive. He was tough, brilliant with numbers, and, unusually for a mobster, honest.
The relationship between Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky is the most important relationship in organized crime in the United States.
Critically, Lansky was able to do complex calculations in his head without committing anything to paper.
These are two incredibly talented and open-minded individuals who realized that if they joined forces using an American corporation as a model, that they could eliminate the possibility of an individual monopolizing profits, and they could share profits and distribute them evenly, and therefore bring a certain stability to organized crime that had never existed before.
And there was another Jewish gangster to get Luciano to think big. Arnold Rothstein. Known along Broadway as the Brain, the Big Bankroll, and the Fixer, Rothstein was a fabulously rich New York businessman.
There were things that Rothstein was doing that nobody else was doing, and Luciano saw the possibilities.
Rothstein could bring off rackets that no one else could dream of.
Arnold Rothstein, was famous as the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. This is a prime example of racketeering. You take a normal activity like a baseball game, you corrupt the players, therefore you can bet on a winning thing.
Rothstein tutored him there about how real money could be made, not just in low-level predatory street crime, that there were bigger things, you could fix things.
And sure enough, bigger things were about to come along for Luciano. In 1919, the US government did an incredible thing. It banned alcohol, believing that it was leading to the moral destruction of the nation. The ban was known as Prohibition, and with America wanting to drink, it was a gift to organized crime gangs, especially in the thirstiest cities like New York.
They saw a real gold mine in Prohibition. And what it did was it turned some of them, like Luciano, they had to become executives. Because now they had to run organizations that either imported booze or manufactured it, and you had to distribute it. So in that sense, they had to run a real organization. It wasn't just go out and mug somebody on the street. You had to be smart now, because you were dealing, instead of thousands, you were dealing with millions. So it turned these people who were really inexperienced, old-fashioned outlaws into business criminal executives overnight.
Luciano, Lansky, and Rothstein proved to be quick learners, and soon they became very rich indeed.
Now that wealth translates into power. It translates into political power. It means that you can buy political protection. It means that you can buy police protection, because alcohol is something everybody wants to do. So they are willing to collude with gangsters. What they don't understand is that once you cooperate with gangsters, you've sold your soul, and the gangsters understood this.
With New York City full of booze, and cops, judges, and council officials being bribed all over the place, Luciano and his associates had free rein to take control of whatever they wanted.
They had their hand in everything because nobody would look at them. Nobody would even consider investigating them. Not the least of which was J. Edgar Hoover.
There is nothing mysterious about the manner in which the Federal Bureau of Investigation works. A special agent must be a good marksman and have the courage to shoot it out with the most venomous of public enemies.
Director Hoover supervising field practice. And
J. Edgar Hoover was the boss of the FBI, and he was eager to make a name for himself.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the paramount law enforcement, and the only national law enforcement agency that could really combat the Mafia, and they didn't do a thing.
Hoover had launched his war on crime during the early 1930s. He went after bank robbers, kidnappers, and killers who were terrorizing the Midwest and outraging the nation.
The FBI mostly went after the headline public enemies like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd,
Machine Gun Kelly, taking people out with,
Hoover had essentially denied that there was a national crime syndicate. He said, these are local gangsters, and this is the job of the local police to deal with it. He didn't want to get involved with these people because they're very well connected politically.
Realizing nobody was going to come after him, Luciano was able to expand his vision and develop new ways for the Mafia to grow.
Luciano saw and could predict that by the late 20s, Prohibition was going to end in America.
And if the Mafia was going to be successful, Luciano had to prevent inter-mob wars from ever breaking out again.
It was terrible for business, and it also threw a spotlight on him. That's why I say he was something like a Bill Gates or a Warren Buffett, and he had to get a different business model.
So, Towards the end of 1931, Luciano summoned the top leaders of 20 mafia factions across the country, including gangsters like Al Capone, to a national conference in Chicago. Luciano then did an extraordinary thing. He proposed an entirely new business structure for organized crime.
He laid out the rules. Here's how we're going to operate. This whole concept that had never existed before, he created a whole new texture, a whole new way of how criminals could operate in America, organized criminals. What he did was he turned predatory street gangs, which had many internal and external wars with each other, he turned them into this one single octopus of an organization that was so different from anything else that ever existed. And it took the American law enforcement almost 60 years to get a handle on it. It was so terrific.
Luciano kept with Maranzano's 5 New York families, but to each family he added a consigliere, a skilled counselor and advisor, whose task was to ensure that problems within families were resolved without the need for violence. Luciano then unveiled his most striking innovation without precedent in the Sicilian Mafia or amongst American gangsters.
Luciano, he created the commission, and the commission would be the board of directors. If any rules for the Mafia throughout the country had to be changed, it would be up to the commission. And if there were any territorial disputes or disputes over rackets, the commission would take care of it. Now, the concept there was to prevent wars.
It is almost precisely what the various countries around the world did when they were faced with the same problem post-World War II. They created the United Nations. One could actually take the UN Charter and for most of it substitute the word families for states and Cosa Nostra for the organization for the United Nations and Commission for Security Council, and the rules would be identical.
As proof of his good intentions, Luciano introduced one other startling change. He would be just one amongst equals. There would be no boss of all bosses. Instead, Luciano introduced a more democratic form of leadership. The commission would consist of a board of 7 family directors, 5 in New York and 1 each in both Chicago and Buffalo. Each would have a single vote with all the decisions determined by the majority. This would ensure all the leaders of the most powerful families had an equal say.
He was this incredible, dynamic genius who saw how the landscape and how the tapestry of the Mafia had to be organized. Here is somebody who comes along in 1931 and envisions that if the Mafia was going to prevail and succeed, it had to be a mirror image of American capitalism.
Luciano had come up with a business structure. It would last for the next 50 years. And because it worked so perfectly, everything was now up for grabs.
But the commission was the second government of this country. It really was. They actually controlled a lot of industries in this country, not the least of which was the restaurant business, the gambling industry. Las Vegas is a great example of it.
They had control of the garment industry, the meat industry, the fish market, the docks, the unions, loan sharking, drugs and prostitution.
Luciano said he was going to turn prostitution into an industry like the A&P, which is a supermarket chain.
They were all powerful.
And and they were making billions of dollars a year. And what was good for the Mafia was good for Luciano, too.
By 1930 standards, Lucky Luciano wasn't even a multi-millionaire anymore, he was a billionaire.
Luciano took a suite in one of the most luxurious hotels in the world, the Waldorf Astoria, and checked in under the name of Charles Ross to protect himself from rival gangsters.
The kind of money he was reaping in millions every week, and he suddenly became a really sharp dresser. Had ladies on his arms all the time, had a private plane. He flew around to racetracks all over the country.
Luciano was also a bachelor and party animal. He rose late, wore handmade suits and shoes from England, and danced the nights away with chorus girls and nightclub singers.
And he operated in this kind of almost open fashion as this suave, debonair type who could roam around New York, nightclubs, he had pieces of everything.
Luciano wined and dined with politicians and rubbed shoulders with stars like Frank Sinatra and the actor of many classic gangster films, George Raft. Luciano's high life was getting him noticed elsewhere. FBI agents began to work out that he was a key player in the underworld, but they had surprisingly little information on him. One statement described Luciano as the leading racketeer along Italian lines, is very powerful and made considerable money in liquor. Another declared, Charles Luciano, alias Lucky, is the head of the underworld in New York. And an FBI memo had Luciano in a conspiracy to smuggle drugs from Europe into the United States. They also had in their hands local police records, which showed Luciano had been arrested 35 times for offenses ranging from traffic violations to assault and robbery with a gun. But despite this evidence, the FBI still decided to ignore him. But there was a man determined to get Luciano. His name was Thomas E. Dewey.
We have made a real start on cleaning the gangsters out of New York.
Dewey was a fiercely ambitious lawyer who, by the age of just 33, had got the top job as New York City's special prosecutor to crack down on organized crime.
In 2 years, we have shown that our people can be protected, that they can be delivered from the grip of the mob.
In the 1930s, Luciano was the face of organized crime.
It was an open secret how important and how big he was.
And Dewey was after him. He realized that Luciano must be making vast sums of money from his criminal enterprises to finance his luxurious lifestyle.
Today, crime is syndicated and organized. A new type of criminal exists who leaves to his hirelings and frontmen the actual offenses and rarely commits an overt act himself. The only way in which the major criminal can be punished is by connecting him to those various layers.
But Dewey had a tough time finding anything he could pin on him. Luciano was careful with every step he took. He was wary of wiretaps, cautious with his telephone conversations, and like his close friend, Meyer Lansky, kept no records on paper. All the incriminating details were in his head. Then, out of the blue, Dewey was offered a lead that could ensnare Luciano in a web of vice crime. A series of police wiretaps in local brothels uncovered clues that an organization called the Combine controlled around 300 establishments in Manhattan and Brooklyn. They discovered that a top Luciano enforcer named David Little Davy Batillo was overseeing the Combine operations. In January 1936, Dewey's investigators raided 80 brothels in the New York City area and arrested over 100 prostitutes and madams.
These arrested women were definitely placed between a rock and a hard place. They had nowhere to go.
The cops started to put the women under real pressure to spill the beans on Luciano.
So many of them were addicted to heroin when they were arrested. Cops waited until the 4th day of the cold turkey withdrawal when they were climbing the walls and desperate to get them to agree to testify against the mob.
Dewey's investigators managed to get 3 or 4 people to flip, to turn. And incredibly, they claimed that they had seen Luciano at meetings where he discussed what kind of percentage his family was getting from these whorehouses.
Even before the trial had commenced, the newspapers had Luciano convicted. The New York Daily News headlined him the droopy-eyed Tsar of the oldest profession. The trial began on May the 12th, 1935. Dewey reigned forth in his opening statement.
Luciano will be shown not to have placed any of the women in houses or taken money from them. Instead, he set up his apartment in the Waldorf Astoria and was the czar of the ring. We will show that Luciano's function was to rule. All other defendants were his servants.
Dewey lined up 68 witnesses, mainly hookers, pimps, and madams, who had been promised shorter sentences, immunity, or probation from aiding the prosecution. Dewey's main strategy was to depict the prostitutes as desperate victims of the Depression, exploited and terrorized by the Combine's ruthless enforcers.
The madam who was hit over the head with the lead stick, for example, went on the witness stand to testify that there was blood all over the place when she was attacked by the very men who were sitting there in the defendant's area.
One of the key witnesses was the notorious Madam Cokie Flo.
Cokie Flo's testimony was typical of the testimony that all of the women gave on the witness stand. It was hearsay. She heard Luciano was going to bring everybody together like a chain of supermarkets. She heard this and she heard that.
The idea that he would discuss in the presence of prostitutes, even a madam, the kind of mundane business stuff just didn't work. It looked like a fix. They got these witnesses to really exaggerate or to invent testimony.
At this stage in the trial, with doubt being cast over the evidence, everything seemed to be going in Luciano's favor. But then, Luciano made a big mistake. Against his lawyer's advice, he insisted on taking to the witness stand to deny all charges.
Dewey's demeanor while interviewing Lucky Luciano while Luciano was under oath on the witness stand was very brilliant. He got him to show his underworld side, the side that wasn't very funny to most people, wasn't very suave or sophisticated to others.
For 4 hours, Dewey pummeled him with questions about his life, his previous convictions, his taxes, his association with other gangsters, and proved that he was lying in answer after answer.
He was really lacerated by Dewey's question.
I'm asking you, do you tell the truth when you are under oath?
I'm telling the truth now.
You don't want to answer that question, do you?
I didn't say I told the truth all the time, but now I'm telling the truth.
Dewey's onslaught had now reduced Luciano to a perspiring, squirming wreck. Far from being an honest businessman, he was revealed as a tax evader.
You have not paid a dime to the state government yet, is that right?
That's right.
And that is because the federal state prosecutes big gangsters and the state does not by income tax. Isn't that so?
I don't know.
Dewey even brought out information, very embarrassing to Luciano, that he had once, when he was a young man, had been an informer in a narcotics investigation. So it made his whole reputation look a little tainted. Here was this top guy. Turned out that once he had been a rat to save his skin.
In the end, Dewey's summation to the jury described Luciano's testimony as
a shocking, disgusting display of sanctimonious perjury, at the end of which I am sure not one of you had a doubt that before you stood not a gambler, not a bookmaker, but the greatest gangster in America.
And Dewey managed to persuade the jury to the end. Luciano was convicted on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Justice McCook gave the sentence.
I am not here to reproach you, but since there is no excuse for your conduct nor for your rehabilitation, to administer adequate sentence, I hereby pronounce a sentence to serve from 30 to 50 years.
The sentence probably did not fit the crime, but it was an instrument on the part of Dewey and the prosecutor's office to try to rid New York of the elements of organized crime that were the most threatening.
Dewey was a crime-busting hero, and it was the start of his meteoric career. He became the governor of New York in 1942 and twice ran for presidency.
Once the alliance between criminals and politicians is smashed, racketeering will come to a prompt end.
In his memories of the case, Luciano wrote,
I still get madder at Dewey's crap more than anything else. That little with the mustache comes right out and admits he got me for everything else but what he charged me with. He knew I didn't have a to do with prostitution, not with none of them broads. But Dewey was such a goddamn racketeer himself in a legal way that he crawled up my back with a frame and stabbed me.
Luciano tried to fight back. He appealed against his sentence, and he ordered for the prostitutes who testified against him to be rounded up so they could now say they had lied in court.
They met up with the mobsters, all is forgiven kind of mentality, and re-addicted to heroin almost immediately. Once they were re-addicted, they brought them cross-country to offices in California, signed briefs that they were rescinding their prior testimony and that they did not mean it, that they told a bunch of lies.
But despite his efforts, Luciano's appeal failed. Luciano was sent to the isolated maximum security Clinton Penitentiary in Dannemora, near the Canadian border. Nicknamed Siberia, it was 500 miles away and a far cry from the luxurious trappings of his Manhattan life.
What a come down from a suite at the Waldorf Towers to a cell.
When they told me I was going to Dannemora, I wasn't sure I could make it. It meant moving out of the Waldorf Towers into a sewer. The worst part of it was, we didn't have any connections up there, and that meant I was in for a rough time. I was willing to put up $1 million bond, and I told them that as soon as I heard that I was going to Dannemora. But once they had me, they wasn't gonna let me go.
But anyone who thought Luciano was finished was mistaken. His foresight in setting up the commission now showed itself.
When he was sentenced, the family didn't dissolve. The organization continued to function. And this is, again, the wisdom of Lucky Luciano, that even though he, the originator, is the first boss to be convicted, he proves his point. It functions well.
Although Luciano remained the boss, Frank Costello, a highly regarded and well-known figure in New York's underworld, took over the day-to-day running of his empire. And Costello continued to bring in millions of dollars and increase the family's fortunes, while his boss planned his next move. And Luciano didn't have to wait long. When America entered the Second World War in 1942, he found that his country needed him. The war in the Atlantic was going badly for the Allies. And the US government was concerned their crucial East Coast docks were under serious threat.
It's the keystone to the war effort on the East Coast. One ship, a French ship in Normandy, caught on fire and sank.
Sparked by an acetylene torch, swept through the proud ship. Thousands of workmen fled for their lives as firemen from all parts of New York and neighboring cities fought the fire around the clock.
The prevailing opinion is that it was accidental, but the US Navy and a lot of other government officials believed it could have been sabotage.
Naval intelligence, desperate to prevent further attacks and German spies from infiltrating the docks, sought the help of the mobsters who controlled the waterfronts. But if they were going to get the help of the dockers, they had to get the Mafia's permission first.
Luciano was so powerful that the Mafia bosses would not consent. These are not patriots. They're not stepping up to the government and saying, yes, sir, and saluting. They're saying, we have to get approval from the boss, our boss. Our boss is not the President of the United States. Our boss is Lucky Luciano, and he's in prison.
To win Luciano's support, the first thing the US government did was move Luciano from the harsh conditions of Dannemora to a prison known as the Country Club of the penal system, Grand Meadow, close to New York. Here, Luciano began negotiations with the authorities and his men.
And sure enough, Luciano acts like he's a patriot now, even though he was still an Italian citizen and never a naturalized American citizen. And he sends out the word through Lansky and other couriers, peace on the waterfront. Not only would there be no sabotage, there would be no work stoppages. Things were going to run smoothly. It's the word from the boss. What an example. A man in prison has so much power that he can control the essential harbor in New York City. If you need any testimonial to his power, that's it.
Luciano then asked for a pardon. He had delivered his side of the bargain, and now wanted freedom.
Guess who's the governor of New York at that time? No other person but Thomas E. Dewey.
In an extraordinary irony, Dewey, the man who put him away for 30 to 50 years, granted Luciano executive clemency in 1946 on the condition that he was deported to Italy and that he would never be allowed back in the US. Dewey's resentment was clear.
Upon the entry of the United States into the war, Luciano's aid was sought by the armed services in inducing others to provide information concerning possible enemy attack. It appears that he cooperated in such an effort, although the actual value of the information produced is not clear.
Luciano had served just 10 years of his 50-year sentence when he left American shores on February the 10th, 1946, bound for Sicily. But within months, Luciano was traveling from Italy to Havana, Cuba, and was back in business. A week-long meeting was held at the Hotel Nacional, where Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and other high-ranking Mafia members discussed the heroin trade.
He was involved in numerous narcotics deals because Italy at that time was really becoming important in the transfer of narcotics, not just to the US, but worldwide. Heroin was becoming a big money maker for the Mafia.
In 1957, in Palermo, Sicily, Luciano was reported to be overseeing meetings with more than 30 Sicilian and American Mafia leaders to create the world's largest heroin exporting rackets. Five years later, in 1962, Luciano was targeted for arrest as an alleged member of a ring that smuggled $150 million worth of heroin into the United States. But before the authorities could get him, Luciano died of a heart attack in Italy. He was 65.
A guy who could demand respect. Luciano was the power to be, he ran the show, willing to resort to violence if he had to. And the system worked. I mean, the guy was good.
Charles Lucky Luciano's reign had been a remarkable one. He transformed the Mafia from the warring street gangs into a highly sophisticated empire. Under Luciano, the Mafia grew to be bigger than General Motors. And by the time he'd finished, the mob was raking in $40 billion a year. And while there had been run-ins with the local law enforcement agencies, the FBI hadn't even known it existed. And if anyone likes to think of Luciano as a criminal genius, they should not forget that he had many people killed, condemned many others to drug addiction and prostitution, and left a terrible wake of misery and suffering behind him. Joe Valachi, hitman for the mob. And the first man to break Omerta, the Mafia's code of silence. Valachi was the first to give the world the phrase, La Cosa Nostra. Valachi was the first to reveal the names of the bosses and their soldiers. He explained the Mafia's structure, their rituals and secrets.
It was the first time anyone could pull back the curtain or paint the canvas of what it was like.
Valachi was the first to expose their bloody history of killings and executions. And knew where the bodies were.
You lived by the gun and by the knife, and you died by the gun and by the knife.
Valachi was the first to blow the lid on a secret empire worth $40 billion a year. And his revelations would change the nature of the battle between the FBI and the Mafia forever. In 1962, 58-year-old Joe Valachi was serving 15 years in Atlanta State Penitentiary for heroin trafficking. And inside with him was his Mafia boss of 30 years, Don Vito Genovese, head of one of the most powerful crime families in America.
Joe went back a long time with Vito. He was in one of Vito's crews, so they knew each other very well, and he always thought he was in Vito's good graces. But Vito was a homicidal maniac.
One day, Vito Genovese arranged for Valachi to be his cellmate. Genovese could do this because he controlled the prison wings with fear and intimidation. Valachi guessed something was up and had good reason to be nervous. Genovese believed that Valachi had put him in prison after squealing to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. One night, Genovese turned to his cellmate.
You know, we take a barrel of apples, and in this barrel of apples there might be a bad apple. Well, this apple has to be removed, and if it ain't removed, it would hurt the rest of the apples.
Then, Genovese walked over to Valachi and kissed him on the cheek. It was the Mafia's kiss of death. To let Valachi know he was the apple to be removed.
Joe Valachi knew what this meant. It meant he was now going to be killed. One way or the other, Vito was out to get him.
Consumed with fear, Valachi saw hitmen everywhere. On the morning of June the 22nd, 1962, he was out in the yard when he saw 3 prisoners coming towards him. Thinking they had been sent by Genovese to kill him, he picked up an iron pipe left by construction workers and braced himself for the attack. Then, another inmate approached him. Valachi swung into action. Valachi's victim was John Joseph Saup, a small-time crook with no Mafia connections. Valachi had killed the wrong man. And he was now facing the death sentence for murder.
Here he is, he's trapped, there's no way out for him. So he sends word to the federal authority that he's willing to sing, come a canary.
To save his skin, Valachi got word to the US Justice Department that he was willing to talk about the Mafia. For Attorney General Robert Kennedy and his staff at the US Justice Department, this was the break they were looking for. Since becoming Attorney General in 1961, Kennedy had pursued a vigorous attack against organized crime. but he had been struggling to penetrate the country's criminal underworld. Now, for the first time in the history of the Mafia, an insider was willing to talk. So Kennedy offered a deal to Valachi. He was permitted to plead guilty to a charge of unpremeditated murder and receive a life sentence on the one condition that he would expose his organization. On July the 17th, 1962, Valachi was secretly taken out of Atlanta prison and flown to Westchester County Jail, just outside New York. He was given the cover of Joseph de Marcona and taken to an isolated cell. FBI agent James P. Flynn was sent to interrogate Valachi and find out what he knew.
Flynn came in and he was tough. He told Valachi, listen, either you tell us what we want to know, or you're no value to us and there's no deal involved.
The FBI had been picking up the phrase Cosa Nostra on recent wiretaps, and they believed that it referred to the Mafia, the organization, or the outfit. But they weren't sure. To get Valachi to loosen his tongue, he played a trick on him.
Flynn bluffed Valachi. He said, what, we know all about Cosa Nostra.
Thinking the FBI had a deeper knowledge of the Mafia than they actually did, Valachi began to talk.
And he, for the first time, revealed what it really meant. It meant our thing, Cosa Nostra. And he told Flynn, we never call ourselves Mafia.
Flynn started to pump Valachi for names, dates, and information.
The FBI only knew the tip of the Mafia iceberg. They had never really penetrated the organization.
Now, the floodgates opened.
What Valachi gave them for the first time, knowing he had to produce, otherwise he was going to stay in prison for the rest of his life, he had to produce an inside story, really pull the curtain back, paint the canvas of what it was like to be a Mafia soldier in the trenches. So for the first time, he started spilling the beans.
Valachi began to reveal the organizational structure of the Mafia. Based on his information, Flynn drew up charts to illustrate how the Cosa Nostra is divided into family units. Each with a boss, an underboss, and lieutenants and soldiers beneath them.
It seemed to the FBI and everybody else that he was a Rosetta Stone. He was telling them the secrets. The hieroglyphics were now exposed.
Valachi told Flynn that these Mafia families extended across America, from Boston to San Francisco. And for the first time, the FBI got a picture of the Mafia's enormous scope and activities. For the next 3 months, from the end of September 1962, Flynn interrogated Valachi for 4 days a week. An average session would last about 3 hours, and then Valachi would become irritated and difficult to handle. Flynn realized that Valachi's main fear was that he could never escape Vito Genovese. Scarcely a day went by without some reference to his former boss. At times, Valachi would lose courage altogether, thinking he was going to die.
What good is it that I'm telling you? Nobody will listen. Nobody will believe. You know what I mean? This Cosa Nostra, it's like a second government. It's too big. I'm a dead man already, and I know it.
Valachi was right to be worried. According to FBI sources, members of the Genovese crime family were looking for Valachi. From his cell, Vito Genovese had put a price tag of $100,000 on Valachi, and now the mob had traced him to the New York area. The FBI, fearful that the Mafia would get to their prize witness, moved Valachi again, this time to the high-security army base at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. By the spring of 1963, Valachi wanted to go public and was keen to expose the powerful criminal organization that he blamed for ruining his life.
Bobby Kennedy became aware of his potential as a person who could publicize how big and how important the Mafia was.
But Kennedy had huge concerns about Valachi's credibility. For the past 30 years, he'd been a ruthless Mafia hitman. According to the Justice Department, he had at least 33 murders under his belt, and was also now singing for his life. How could anyone be sure that Valachi was telling the truth? So the FBI decided to use it to test his credibility. Flynn had gathered material for the New York City police during his interrogation of Valachi. The police department had struggled with 30 years of unsolved murder cases, dating back to the Mafia gang wars and the subsequent Cosa Nostra power struggle. Using Valachi's accounts as a guide, the intelligence unit searched the department's files in a precinct-by-precinct operation, checking the scattered and unconfirmed facts against his detailed information. They found that Valachi's version of the gang slayings and killings, including the dates, locations, and the circumstances, could all be verified. With the FBI now convinced that Valachi could be relied on, they got him ready to testify. In September 1963, Valachi was flown to Washington to face an investigating Senate committee on organized crime across America. Over 2 weeks in October, he would appear as the star witness, giving first-hand accounts of life as a Mafia hitman. The hearings were broadcast across the country and became a national event.
Go right here, please. Go.
The United States is a new country. We don't have mythology the way older countries had. We had cowboys and Indians, and we had racketeers. This was a way for people within the country to look at all those movies that they had seen before about the underworld and put it all together. I think the public was fascinated by it.
The nation's underworld gets the unwelcome spotlight of publicity as the Senate's Investigations Subcommittee begins new hearings on crime. Arkansas Senator McClelland is at the helm. Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia. This he describes as the government of organized gambling, narcotics peddling, extortion, racketeering, and controlling of certain trade unions. He says the income runs into billions.
Well, gentlemen, as you know, we have brought to Queens County this morning the witness, Joe Valachi. We are determined to expose every facet of his testimony and to pursue this thing as far as we possibly can.
What was his demeanor during your conversation inside over coffee?
Apparently, he's a willing witness, and he's anxious to get these things off his chest, and we had no difficulty with him at all.
Did he seem worried at all?
I wouldn't say he was worried. I think the man is naturally, under all of the circumstances, nervous and a bit upset. But beyond that, he's a good witness.
Mr. O'Connor, don't you get the feeling that he's rather enjoying all this?
I would make no comment about that.
As the hearings got underway, Valachi was asked why he had murdered another inmate in Atlanta prison.
Why did you decide to kill him at that time, at that spot?
Because he's the guy I spotted at that time. In other words, I felt that was my last day, in plain English, Senator. I felt that was my last day.
You thought it was your last day?
That I would be alive.
Well, did you feel that you could get all of them before they could get you?
Just probably, I don't know what I would have done if I don't see him. See, I can't answer what I would have done.
In other words, you felt helpless and surrounded, and you decided to strike when you could.
If I when I saw him, yeah.
You thought that if you killed this man, who you thought was going to kill you anyway, that this.
I got some satisfaction, Senator. Put it that way.
Got some satisfaction.
Despite all the razzmatazz surrounding this public event, Valachi's testimony was a stark reminder that he was a cold-blooded killer. Then Valachi's interrogation really began.
When did you become a member of this organization?
1930.
1930. What is the name of it? It is
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Cosa Nostra in Italian.
Our thing and our family in English.
Our thing and our family in English.
Valachi then revealed how he came to join the Mafia. Valachi took the committee back to his low-life roots in the slums of New York in the early 1900s. His parents were from Naples, and they had 17 children. Only 6 survived. By the time he was 18, he was the driver with a notorious gang called the Minutemen. They robbed hundreds of clothing and jewelry stores between 1919 and 1923, smashing shop windows and grabbing whatever they could before the cops came. But one day they were caught, and Valachi was sent to the infamous Sing Sing prison on the Hudson River. In Sing Sing, the 21-year-old Valachi made friends with a gangster named Alessandro Valero. It was then that Valachi first learned about a secret organization that he would soon know as La Cosa Nostra. And Valachi wanted to be a part of it.
Now, we talk about myself now. I am a chauffeur, which I've been known through the years, that I was a good driver. In fact, other mobs used to try and borrow me, which I never wanted to go.
Valachi explained to the Senate committee how he became a driver for one of New York's top mafia gangs, led by Sicilian-born Salvatore Maranzano. It was 1929, and Maranzano was locked in a bloody power struggle with his rival, Giuseppe Masseria. Valachi made it known to Maranzano that he wanted in. And as a test, he was sent as the driver on a contract to murder one of Masseria's top henchmen. After the hit, Valachi got the call. He was going to be a made man, or a soldier in the Mafia. Valachi then revealed to the committee the rituals of his initiation ceremony into the mob. Valachi described how he was driven to a country house about 90 miles from New York. Valachi said he was asked to join 30 other members around a table. His boss, Don Salvatore Maranzano, was going to conduct the initiation.
He told him how you got inducted, omerta, the whole code. That once you became a member, you could never leave. How you had to either become an earner or be a hitman, kill somebody before you could even be qualified to be an inductee.
Valachi then revealed to the Senate committee the secrets of the Mafia's blood and fire initiation ceremony into the mob.
Well, he had the knife and the gun on the table. He went on to explain that you live by the gun and by the knife, and you die by the gun and by the knife.
Did you have a full understanding of what that meant at the time?
Yes, I did.
It meant that you was what?
Well, expect to die by the gun and by the
In
knife.
other words, when you took that oath, you expected someday to die either by the gun or by the knife.
Right.
That's what you were dedicating yourself to.
Right.
Valachi went on to explain that he was told to make a cup with his hands. Paper was placed inside and set alight. He was then asked to move it from side to side and told that he would burn like the paper if he betrayed the secrets of the Cosa Nostra. Valachi was then introduced to his gomba, his godfather, Joe Bonanno, who would be his guide and mentor. Bonanno asked Valachi for his trigger finger. And pricked it with his tie pin. He then pricked his own and placed it against Valachi's. Maranzano then announced that they are all family now.
All right, then what happened? Then They all shake hands. Everybody gets up and shake hands. They say a few more words together, which I can't recall. They also said in Sicilian.
But did you know what they meant?
Well, actually, I never asked what it meant. I never did ask what it meant, but it meant like sort of in the style of an organization, or in that style. But you don't bother. I didn't bother. I never did bother.
You never did what?
I never bothered to find out what it meant, but I had an idea what it meant.
Well, you had an idea. What was your idea?
All tied up. We're all tied up.
We're all together.
All together.
All together.
Right.
Sink together, hang together, live together.
Yes.
Valachi's revelations explained why this secret organization had managed to remain hidden for so long. Anyone who squealed would pay the ultimate price. Fear had preserved the silence for 30 years. Now, Valachi had broken that silence forever.
Senator, can I say something, Senator?
Yes.
As to what I'm telling you now, I need to go no further to say nothing else. This is what I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody. This is my doom. This is the promise I'm breaking. Now, even if I talk, I should never talk about this, and I'm doing so.
The mob, of course, was horrified. And, in the past, they had been able to reach people in prison and kill them. And they thought somehow if they offered enough money, somebody would be willing to try to bump them off.
With Genovese's contract of $100,000 hanging over Valachi's head, there were now real fears of a direct attack on the Senate hearings.
What can you tell us about this threat, Jim?
Well, over the weekend, we received information from the FBI that their information was to the effect that the bomb would be placed in the room this morning, and also that there might be one or several persons here with guns who would attempt to assassinate the witness.
And what precautions have you taken?
I don't think we ought to talk about it.
How about Mr. Valachi? Did you tell him about it?
No, we didn't.
Well, there was supposedly a report that somebody was going to try to shoot you or put a bomb in here or something.
Where'd they get that?
What do you think about the Yankees and the Dodgers the other day?
I don't know anything about it.
How do you feel about it?
I might feel, I'm in the same position from the beginning. I'm hot from the beginning. You understand what I mean? Don't make any difference.
Most of Valachi's testimony was devoted to tracing the hierarchy of the American Mafia. Valachi explained to the Senate committee how the smooth-working Mafia organization of today evolved from the warring street gangs and power struggles of the early 1900s. Valachi took the committee back to a meeting in 1931 when Sicilian boss Salvatore Maranzano took control of the New York Mafia. Valachi told how Maranzano laid out his grand plan to an audience of 400 mobsters. That the gangs of New York would now be organized into 5 families to control the boroughs of the Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and Staten Island. Valachi told how Maranzano had declared himself the absolute ruler. He would be the boss of all bosses, and if anyone disagreed, they would be killed. Valachi then explained how one man did disagree. and he revealed how Charles Lucky Luciano had Maranzano executed. Luciano then introduced a more democratic form of leadership. He eliminated the boss of all bosses and created the Commission, effectively a board of directors to resolve mafia disputes. And this led to an era of peace, cooperation, and prosperity. Valachi then named the present leaders of the 5 New York families. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Giuseppe Magliocco, Joseph Bonanno, and Gaetano Lucchesi. These are the men, Valachi told the committee, who run a huge web of organized crime in the city, involving gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, narcotics, and the infiltration of the mafia into legitimate businesses.
And about how many soldiers would usually be under a boss?
Well, Vito Genovese has about 450.
400?
In and around that. Yeah.
450?
About 450. Could be even 500.
Valachi then revealed the names of over 130 members of the Genovese crime family and identified members of all the other New York families, claiming to know 289 mafiosi. All was laid out for the committee on 5 huge family charts.
I think what Valachi did was explain what the FBI had and didn't know they had. Frequently, people in the mob and in other areas of criminal activity know others by nicknames. They may know their faces, but they don't know their actual names. To the extent that we now had law enforcement had their actual names, we probably learned that for the first time. But other than that, I think Valachi's testimony pretty much stands on its own. I mean, and it has been proven accurate over time.
Those that you have been able to identify in the 5 families, you have marked with stars up on these charts.
Yes. The others that are not on the chart, you know them by aliases, and you didn't know their other names.
Right.
And therefore, you didn't undertake to name them.
Right.
Except that you could give their real name along with their alias.
Right.
Very well.
He was the one who exposed it all. The families, the names of the people, the levels of authority, starting with the capo di tutti capi down to the soldiers.
But there were some critics skeptical of Valachi's testimonies, believing that as a foot soldier, he wouldn't have been privileged to any information relating to Cosa Nostra's inner circle.
I think it is a mistake to think of a soldier as being a low-level figure. They're not. They are serious people within the mob. The only people above a soldier in a direct line of authority is the capo and the boss. So the soldier is a person high up in the mob by the very nature of being admitted to the mob. They are given mob secrets. They are told about what has occurred. They need to know who other people are within the mob because they're free to cross anybody who's outside the mob, but no one who's in the mob. And so they tend to know a great deal.
Valachi used his testimony to get back at Genovese.
I think you might at this time digress just a moment to tell how much power, how much authority the boss, like Genovese, has over the family, over the soldier members like you?
Senator, I happen to know Vito's power. He not only has the power in our family, he also controls the power in Gambino family and the Lachiza family.
In other words, his word becomes law. That makes it
Right,
legal.
right.
Can he and does he pass out death sentences?
Well, he passes them out, then they tell you, well, he was a rat, he was this. They tell you anything they want to tell you.
He passes them out.
Right.
You know that of your own knowledge.
That is for sure.
Valachi's testimony was a gold mine. He confirmed Cosa Nostra was the Mafia. He revealed the names of the bosses and their soldiers. He explained their structure, their rituals and secrets. He exposed their bloody history. Above all, Valachi's testimony gave the FBI the targets and led to a change in priorities. By 1963, the FBI's New York office had increased the number of its agents specializing in organized crime from 4 to 140. The following year, the FBI used hidden microphones to record Teamsters union boss Jimmy Hoffa in a series of exchanges with the Detroit Mafia. He was jailed for 8 years. For the FBI, electronic surveillance was the future for cracking down on organized crime.
I remember as a young agent, as a young organized crime agent in the early 1970s, all over the country we did wiretaps of the interstate gambling operations that flourished and were controlled by the Mafia. We made thousands of arrests and broke up hundreds of large gambling combines in an effort to choke off the flow, one of their great sources of money.
Thanks to Valachi's revelations, the FBI's campaign against the Mafia progressed to a new level. Critically, for Attorney General Robert Kennedy, it was just the beginning.
The disclosures of Joseph Valachi and of others with knowledge of criminal operations in various parts of the country have helped to give us unprecedented understanding of how these operations work.
Valachi was the first really important cog in bringing down and destroying, or at least wounding, the Mafia in America. Without him, it might have taken another 15, 20 years, because there were no defectives. Even though he was low-ranking, he still knew enough to sensationalize his story and to get the public really alerted and warned about the threat of the Mafia.
As for Joe Valachi, he was returned to the relative comfort of the District of Columbia Jail in Washington, where he had been kept during the hearings. Robert Kennedy, ever shrewd, believed Valachi had a lot more to offer.
Bobby Kennedy realized that there was a gold mine in him. So what he did was said, why don't you write your memoir, everything you can remember about the Mafia?
Over 13 months, Valachi painstakingly produced more than 300,000 words on notepads from his cell in Washington. He had been there from the very beginning of the modern Mafia and it was a unique day-by-day portrayal over a 30-year period of his life as a hitman. But for someone who had very little schooling, Valachi's memoir was no literary masterpiece.
It's unprintable, it's unpublishable, it's unreadable probably.
Kennedy called for a ghostwriter.
The Justice Department got a writer, Peter Mass, to sit down, use the memoir, and also discuss Valachi's life with him.
This was to form a book which the Justice Department hoped would encourage other informers to come forward. During this period, the department started making plans to reward Valachi for his cooperation, and were even thinking of sending him somewhere to relax in the sun.
Bobby Kennedy had some wild scheme that maybe he could find a girlfriend or bring Valachi's wife and put him on some desert island where he could live out the rest of his life. But that was impossible. And he still had a sentence from murdering that fellow convict, the wrong man.
But killing the wrong man wasn't the only thing stopping him going to a desert island. The Italian-American newspaper, Il Progresso, had got hold of Valachi's manuscript and was outraged. It printed a virulent editorial against the forthcoming book, saying it was perpetuating the kind of image of criminality associated with the many Italian names in Valachi's testimony. This snowballed into a massive surge from pressure groups proclaiming it would slur all Italian Americans. Their campaign was successful. The White House stepped in and halted its publication. Overnight, everything changed for Valachi. He was told the whole thing was off and was hauled out of his Washington comfort zone and transported back into the harsh federal prison system. He was placed in a small cold cell in Michigan, where he was to spend the rest of his sentence in solitary confinement. Valachi despaired. On the morning of April the 11th, 1966, he took the mains lead from his radio and stepped into a shower cubicle. The showerhead was unable to hold Valachi's weight, and he was found collapsed and barely alive on the floor by a guard soon afterwards. The Justice Department realized that they had to look after their prize witness better.
They took him out of the unpleasant northern prisons. They sent him to what they considered the best place for him, a place called La Tuna, near the Mexican border in Texas. And they gave him a suite where he had a kitchenette and he had a better, more comfortable bed. They tried to make life as convenient and comfortable as possible. Whenever the Justice Department now gets a real top-notch defector, they send him to what is called the Valachi suite.
In 1968, and 5 years after he had given away the Mafia's secrets to the world, Valachi finally got to read the book based on his life. It was called The Valachi Papers, and it became a bestseller. Valachi never received a penny from it. book was turned into a feature film in 1972. Valachi was played by Charles Bronson. The real Joe Valachi died of a heart attack in 1971 at La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution in Texas. He outlived his Mafia boss, Vito Genovese, by 2 years. The $100,000 bounty placed on Valachi's head by Genovese was never collected. John Gotti was the most famous gangster since Al Capone.
His picture's on page 1 of newspapers. His name is all over TV. He's a headline figure.
He brutally murdered his way to become head of the most powerful crime family in America.
John Gotti took charge of what's called the Gambino crime family shortly after his reputed predecessor was gunned down.
Addicted to fame, he adored the attention of the world's media and became America's most high-profile criminal.
He was Moby Dick in the organized crime world. Everybody wanted to prosecute John Gotti.
In New York, the Gotti trial is the hottest show off Broadway.
He made a mockery of the law, time and again walking free from court.
I'm not saying he didn't do it. I simply had my doubts.
But overconfident and arrogant, he thought he could take on the might of the FBI.
Here was this guy, he had this come and get me attitude to law enforcement. He made fun of them.
But what he did didn't just spell his end, but the ruination of America's most powerful crime family. A Monday evening in December 1985, in central Manhattan, New York. At Sparks Steakhouse, Paul Castellano, one of the most powerful mobsters in New York, arrives for dinner, accompanied by his driver, Tommy Bellotti. 4 men are waiting for them. Across the street, 2 men watch the events from a parked car.
At least 3 gunmen in New York City tonight
shot and killed a man identified by police as Paul Castellano, reputed chief of the Gambino Mafia family.
That's the nation's most powerful organized crime organization.
Well, the king is dead. Paul Castellano, reputed boss of bosses, executed on a New York City street yesterday.
The assassination of Paul Castellano was one of the most dramatic hits in Mafia history. The murder of a family boss was a once-in-a-generation event. Most surprising, though, was the man who masterminded the hit, John Gotti.
Gotti was just not a well-known or well-respected figure prior to the killing of Castellano.
I mean, his initial forte in organized crime was hijacking trucks and beating people up and killing people. He was a thug, in my view.
Gotti started his life in crime in the late 1950s as a low-level street thug. But he had big ambitions. he had his eye on joining the most profitable criminal organization in America.
Mob profits are going to top $100 billion this year.
Add to that, the inflated costs of consumer goods and services in the total bill is more than $77 for every American.
Every year.
And they're into everything from low-level street crimes to sophisticated white-collar crime.
Garbage carting, the piers, the garment industry.
Labor racketeering, and of course, murder.
In 1973, Gotti was given the opportunity to join the most powerful of the 5 mafia families in New York, the Gambinos.
Conservative estimates indicate that the Gambino family was making easily $400 to $500 million a year.
Head of the family was Don Carlo Gambino. His nephew had recently been kidnapped and murdered by members of the Irish mob. Gambino wanted revenge, and he offered Gotti his chance to make his bones in the Mafia.
Making your bones means you've proved your tutorship and that you are now ready for full-fledged membership as a maid or soldier in the family.
Gotti was part of the team that killed James McBratney in revenge for the kidnapping. He was sentenced to 7 years, but was out in less than 2. On his release, Gotti was richly rewarded. He was initiated into the Mafia and dramatically promoted straight to captain in charge of his own crew.
It's one of the most violent and ruthless crews in the Gambino family. And they're engaged in everything from truck hijackings to murders and loan sharking.
They were really crazy people. And hijack is really a very violent people. And that's what Gotti was.
By 1976, Gotti was a rising star in New York's most powerful crime organization.
You know, you can get pretty far in life if you're willing to shoot somebody who doesn't give you your way, right? That's a pretty significant advantage.
Then, a change at the head of the family would allow Gotti to aim for the highest prize of all. After 20 years at the head of the Gambino family, Carlo Gambino died. His brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, took charge. Castellano saw himself as more of a businessman than a street mobster, something that riled roughnecks like Gotti.
Paul was remote and sort of removed from the street people.
He didn't associate with his own members of organized crime. He thought he was too important and too wealthy. They called him the Pope sometimes, or the man on the hill.
From his mansion on Staten Island, Castellano took a dim view of street crews like Gotti's and was cutting them out of the most profitable deals.
It was the kind of crew that Paul Castellano didn't really favor because they were looked upon as hard muscle guys, jaw breakers, knee breakers, but pea-brained.
He was a family of the haves and the have-nots. Castellano and all his side made all the money. The Gotti's crews are all struggling, just trying to earn enough money to get by.
Gotti began to nurture a growing hatred of Paul Castellano. But this factionalism within the family was not the only problem that the Gambinos were facing. The government was getting its act together and was planning to wage war on the Mafia. For years, the Mafia had prospered as only the low-level members would get convicted, whilst the top guys, the brains behind operations, always managed to keep their hands clean.
Very often, In a Darwinian sense, you took out the lame and the weak and you allowed the strong to survive.
The bosses, the underbosses, the consiglieri, even the capos, the captains, who ran the street units, they never pulled the trigger. They never really extorted directly money from anyone. They were on the receiving end, but they weren't on the working end.
But now, the FBI were going to target the top-ranking members and build new squads to take on each of the 5 New York families. Head of the Gambino squad was Bruce Mao.
When we started out in 1980, there's very little intelligence in the Gambino family, so we basically started from scratch.
Mao had to discover a way to break into an organization which operated by a strict code of silence.
When you investigate a crime family, you always look for a weak link and try to find some place where they're vulnerable, where somebody's talking. We like to find a gossip. And one of the first cases we opened was targeting against John Gotti.
John Gotti had a sidekick, a friend who went back to his teenage days. Name was Fat Angie, Angelo Ruggiero. Angie Ruggiero was intimately known as Quack Quack.
How do we guess?
He gossiped a lot. He liked to talk. He liked to blab.
In 1981, Mao's team got court permission to tap Angelo Ruggiero's phone and then bug his home. It wasn't long before the wires provided dramatic results.
During the Ruggiero wire, we realized that these guys were involved in major heroin activity. They were pushing approximately 50 kilos of heroin in a 6-month period here in New York.
Right, don't worry about nothing, all right? How about our friend over there? What time you be at, Pete?
The FBI arrested Angelo Ruggiero in 1983 on drugs charges, but not Gotti. They had nothing to link him directly to the crime.
We know John Gotti knew about it. He knew we got a piece of it, but he wasn't actually involved in the physical trafficking of the product itself.
But he wasn't off the hook yet. Although the Mafia profited from narcotics, many bosses, including Paul Castellano, made a rule officially banning their crews from dealing drugs on pain of death.
He had this edict, and it was very effective. He could use it whenever he wanted to get rid of somebody he didn't like if they got mixed up in narcotics.
Castellano now had the perfect excuse to rid himself of Gotti.
Castellano wasn't a big fan of John Gotti, Ruggiero, and they weren't like his fair-haired boys. So he definitely would have had him killed. And he had the manpower and the horsepower and the firepower to do it.
It was a kill or be killed situation.
Gotti realized he had to strike first. But the killing of a mob boss was no ordinary hit. The Mafia have strict rules. He would need permission from the heads of the other 4 New York families. But a lowly Mafia captain could easily be killed just for suggesting that he wanted to take out his boss.
Now, for the first time, Gotti, and this was unforeseen, showed strategic sense and unforeseen acumen.
Gotti gambled that the other bosses were tired of Castellano's high-handed manner and would be happy to see the back of him. His gamble paid off. Amazingly, 3 of the New York bosses gave the go-ahead for the upstart capo to take Castellano out. He now needed a hit team. In an audacious move, he approached his most powerful Gambino rival, wealthy Castellano loyalist, Sammy Gravano. He successfully enticed him to be his right-hand man. From his new recruits, Gotti discovered some crucial inside information.
Now, Castellano had become so overconfident. He had been the boss for 10 years. There'd been no attempts against him. He felt immune. And he rode around only with one lieutenant, a guy by the name of Valachi. And he was unarmed, no bodyguards.
They learned that Castellano was supposed to have dinner at a restaurant called Sparks Steakhouse on the night of December 16, 1985.
They knew the hour, they knew how he was going to arrive there.
And so they assembled their crew, their hit teams.
He devised a way of killing Castellano. And it really was a brilliant coup that he engineered.
Gotti worked out he could use the crowded streets as cover for the hitmen.
He had everybody dress in white trench coats and also wear Russian fur hats. And the idea was that everybody would look the same, so any passers-by on the street could not really make a solid identification.
In a final bold move, Gotti would be only feet away to oversee the execution. His new right-hand man, Sammy Gravano, would be sat beside him. What happened next would change the Mafia forever.
The four shooters were waiting for him, and you've seen the pictures. They shot him dead right there as they got out of the car.
You talk about shock and awe like in the past Iraqi wars. This is shock and awe for the Gambino family. Within a few days, the whole Gambino family knew that John Gotti did this.
Now the scale of Gotti's ambition finally became clear. In another show of clever strategy, he packed a meeting of Gambino captains with his own supporters.
Frank DeCicco stands up and says, "I nominate John Gotti to be the next boss of the Gambino family." Of course, Gotti sitting there as one of the captains. John was elected the boss of the Gambino family. This is in January of 1986.
John Gotti took charge of what's called the Gambino crime family shortly after his reputed predecessor was gunned down.
And the man that succeeded him, or is believed to have succeeded him, is a man by the name of John Gotti.
So you think he's behind this?
Well, certainly I would think he heads the enforcement arm of the Gambino family, and certainly they'd have to consult with him.
Until now, the Mafia had been a secret society exerting its power from the shadows.
A traditional mob boss looked to be under the radar. They wanted to control their criminal activities through intermediaries. They did not want to be seen as a powerful individual who could be targeted by law enforcement. Gotti was precisely the opposite.
Gotti attracted attention in a way no other boss had ever done.
Immediately after becoming the boss of the Gambino family, his whole exterior changed. Previously, he wore windbreakers, black T-shirts. He had the jewelry of a two-bit mafioso. Suddenly, overnight, he switches. He's now wearing tailored suits, cashmere coats, even monogrammed socks. I mean, he went to great lengths to have this appearance of being an emperor.
45 years old, Gotti has become quickly recognizable, if only for his custom-made suits and his frequent stops at the Stylorama hair salon.
He's got very good taste. He likes his hair extremely perfect. He's such a gentleman that, you know, you can't believe it.
He was also a big-time gambler, sometimes flashing as much as $100,000 in a weekend.
Gotti loved the limelight. He talked about it all the time, he had his public. He didn't mind being stared at in restaurants. He boasted how important he was. He was a megalomaniac.
The press nicknamed him the Dapper Don. But for all the fancy suits, Gotti was a street mobster, and he couldn't shake free from his past. Even as he ascended to the throne of the Gambino family, Gotti was awaiting trial on an assault charge. In 1984, nearly 2 years earlier, he had attacked Romuald Pajsek, a refrigerator salesman from Queens, in an absurd incident.
That was a traffic dispute. It was about a parking space. And John Gotti slapped Romuald Pajsek in the face.
And they also stole about $300 from him.
Pajsek didn't know who he was, went to the police. That's all that case was.
Somebody who's going to be in the mob boss doesn't put himself in the position where he can be arrested for what is essentially a meaningless incident.
Then before it goes to trial, all this Castellano stuff happens, and all of a sudden, poor Romuald Pajsek is testifying against the #1 criminal in the country.
Pajsek had good reason to fear him when a terrifying story from Gotti's past surfaced in the press.
In 1980, Gotti's 12-year-old son was killed when he ran out in front of a neighbor's car.
His son ran out into the street, a next-door neighbor, not seeing him and not having done anything wrong, clearly an accident, killed the young man.
Media stories told how the distraught driver, John Favara, was menaced by Gotti's wife with a baseball bat when he tried to apologize. After that, Favara tried to flee the neighborhood.
He was selling his house and moving, and the day before he moved, he was kidnapped. And the story that was circulated was that Gotti himself cut him in half with a chainsaw. When that story hit the media, everybody was terrified of Gotti.
And having heard what happened to Favara, Pajsek had a sudden change of heart about testifying.
If I did go stand there and say that this is Mr. Gotti and this is Mr. Coletta, they assaulted me and robbed me, I'm not sure.
Pajsek's loss of memory spawned lurid headlines.
The brake linings on his car had been cut, and also he'd been threatened by people on the street.
So, you know, who's to blame him for the I forgot-y stuff?
Gotti walked free from court for the first time. He had defeated New York's combined forces of law and order. But less than 2 weeks later, in April 1986, he was back on trial. This time, it was the turn of the federal prosecutors. They were much more serious charges, and young assistant prosecutor John Gleason hoped they would hit Gotti with a maximum sentence of 20 years.
It was a racketeering case with what we call predicate acts, particular crimes that they committed as part of their membership in the Gambino family.
It should have been a humiliation for Gotti, but instead, he turned it into a photo opportunity.
The supermodel of mobsters, Gotti on magazine covers, newspaper headlines. One New York tabloid even followed his court suits, the cut, not the criminal, in a daily fashion column called Gotti's Garb. And every day at the courthouse, the Dapper Don plays to a sellout crowd.
I'm interested in the case because Gotti's kind of cool.
Gotti has been a cover boy. He's probably the first mob cover boy.
Gotti happily obliged his public with a stellar performance, nonchalant and apparently unconcerned by the trial going on around him.
Overnight, it became a media sensation because of the attraction to John Gotti.
Gotti even tried to assiduously cultivate members of the press.
He would have espresso with some brandy that he would pour in, or anisette, and he often invited the women reporters, never the male reporters, to share these drinks with him. So he opened doors for the women. He considered himself a new element in organized crime, and he was somebody who was untouchable.
Although he played the part of the Dapper Don, when the trial started, he fell back on the tactics of the street.
He was constantly berating me. I'd walk past him to go to sidebar, and he would say, "Your mother's a whore. You're a junkie."
Worse still, Gotti's lawyers proceeded to lay into the prosecutor's witnesses, who were all ex-mobsters.
Their records were even worse than Gotti's record. They were all murderers, horrendous, violent criminals. And at the same time, there was really no bugged evidence, there was no electronic eavesdropping, and lo and behold, Gotti was acquitted.
When the verdict was read today, gasps were heard in the courtroom. Gotti smiled, then glared over at the prosecutors and shouted, "Shame on them."
The jury's job was to decide whether or not the defendants were guilty. They did their job, and that is the end of that.
But what nobody knew at the time was that Gotti's victory had always been guaranteed.
Gotti had an insurance policy that he'd get a not guilty verdict. One of the jurors was bribed.
Later, juror George Pape would be found guilty of accepting $60,000 to withhold a guilty verdict. But at the time, the case was a disaster for the government.
It was a prosecutor's nightmare. It was a horror show. And John Gotti loved it. He enjoyed every minute of it. He knew he wasn't going to get convicted. He knew he had a free ride. He knew there was no downside for him in the trial, only an upside.
No, it's no problem. No problem.
Gotti had made a mockery of the court again. But the attempt to try to convict him had a higher price. In the course of the trial, the prosecution had called two of Gotti's crew as witnesses, and in doing so revealed them as FBI informants. Two years after the trial, Willie Boy Johnson, a childhood friend of Gotti's, was found murdered. The other informant, Billy Batista, was never found.
Now this incensed the FBI because it was giving away what they considered two valuable informers in essentially what they considered a weak case. And it caused not just a dispute, but a rift.
As each law enforcement agency set their sights on Gotti, rifts and rivalries grew up between them, seriously hampering efforts to convict him.
It really was an indictment of law enforcement that for so many years we allowed them to gain strength, not cooperating with one another.
You had the FBI investigating him. You had the Queens DA's office investigating him. You had the Manhattan DA's office investigating him. You had something called the State Organized Crime Task Force investigating him. And they were actually, it's so comical, at one time, 3 of them had separate bugs in Gotti's Queens headquarters, the Bergen Fish and Hunt Club. I mean, it was a joke.
Next to try and nail Gotti was the New York State Organized Crime Task Force. Its boss, Ronald Goldstock, believed that one of his bugs had recorded Gotti ordering a shooting. And so, they became the third organization to take on the Dapper Don.
John Gotti, alleged in the indictment to be the boss of the Gambino family, is now under indictment. This then is another in a long line of actions taken by state, local, and federal officials, which will inevitably change the face of organized crime.
In New York City this morning, the man police call the country's most powerful crime boss faces the possibility of life in prison for allegedly ordering the shooting of a union official.
That union official, John O'Connor, had smashed up a restaurant owned by a friend of Gotti's. In revenge, he was shot 4 times in the back. But survived. In the courtroom, witnesses testified that Gotti had ordered the shootings, and Goldstock was convinced that he had the evidence he needed on the tapes.
My sense was everybody in the courtroom who was watching the case and how it went in believed there was going to be a conviction.
But when the tapes were played in court, the terrible quality of the recordings placed serious doubt on the solidity of the case.
A jury brought in its verdict today on the man called the Dapper Don.
How say you with respect to defendant John Gotti? We find him not guilty.
We were stunned by the acquittal of Gotti. We did not believe that that could have happened.
Gotti walked free from court a 3rd time.
There was nothing to connect up Mr. Gotti from what happened. Zilch. I'm not saying he didn't do it. I simply had my doubts.
The government thinks you just say Mafia and you sit down on your backside and that's enough. It's not enough in America to say Mafia and sit down.
That night, as Gotti celebrated his victory, the media bestowed on him a new title, the Teflon Don, because no charges ever stuck.
We're all happy. We're all happy. Look at a good decision. The whole city should be happy.
There was actually street parties. People came out and cheered him. So here you have this cruel, vicious killer who's looked upon in some way as a hero. It's a terrifying and it's a terrible indictment, not just of the media, but also of this vicarious kick the public gets out of figures like John Gotti.
They wanted to see something like Vito Corleone, or Jesse James, and he saw that. He milked it for all he could milk it for. He was cast as this dapper Don, this Teflon Don. It was a gloss on him he certainly didn't deserve. He was just a thug.
Never before had a criminal appeared so powerful, so beyond the law. John Gotti had emerged triumphant from court 3 times in just 4 years, and the government were desperate that he be brought down.
A lot of people for the first time were saying, you'll never get him. He's a Teflon Don, he's untouchable.
But in 1989, after 4 years of painstaking surveillance work, the FBI were ready to make their move.
Our motto was patience and perseverance. Take all the time you want and just stick at it through thick or thin.
And their years of patience were beginning to pay off. Slowly, Mao's team made contact with a wide range of people connected to the Gambino family.
There's a lot of people out there that looked like they were regular, undiluted wise guys who were actually informants for the FBI.
The FBI learned that Gotti now liked to spend his time in the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in New York's Little Italy district. Mao ordered 24-hour surveillance of the club.
This is Little Italy. It's a very hard place to park cars, to conduct surveillance without being discovered.
The FBI covertly secured a lease of a building with a direct view to the door of the Ravenite. They installed thousands of dollars of camera equipment, and studying hours of footage, they discovered something remarkable. Gotti was so overconfident that he was openly running his organization from the Ravenite Social Club.
He never seemed to understand he was running a secret organization, an underground criminal outfit. And he demands that at least once a week, his soldiers or his capos have to show up and kiss his ring like he's a pope.
They're not supposed to meet in public. They're supposed to be clandestine. They normally use safe houses. And from Monday through Friday, John Gotti would hold court at this club 5 nights a week.
And he gives Bruce Mao and the FBI incredible opportunities to unearth evidence that only a fool would hand over to them. They could photograph everybody going in and out of the Ravenite. They find out people they didn't know were in any way connected. Union leaders, politicians, mobsters that were not known as Gambino members. Gotti hands them a who's who in the mob.
Good though the surveillance was, photos and video from outside the club would not make a case against Gotti. They needed to be able to hear what was being said inside. Mao called in the FBI's head of electronic surveillance, Jim Kallstrom, to get a device into the club.
I don't know if you've driven down Mulberry Street in New York. A very close environment. A lot of mobsters living there, coming and going. So to make an entry into a building covertly, you know, it's not simple. Very complicated.
Kallstrom's people are professional burglars. They're lockpicks. They can break through locks and go through alarms. They can break into safes. That's what they do. At the risk of retribution, they could be shot or killed going in there.
And there's never a time when the risk is zero. Never. Never a time.
Informants had told Mao's team that meetings took place at a table at the rear of the club.
They broke into the club, they got through the lock, they disabled the alarm system, and they were to install a bug in the club.
With the bugs in place, the FBI thought that they were finally in a winning position. But they would discover it wasn't that simple.
You couldn't hear yourself talk in the Ravenite Social Club. Extremely noisy. Music played, all on purpose to stop any microphone.
And the tech guys went in several times. We put a bug below the table, we put a bug above the table, in the wall, and this had 5 bugs on this one table. We brought in tech guys from Washington to try to filter out all the background noise, but it just didn't work out.
They couldn't make out any words in the recordings, although it was possible to make out Gotti's voice. But there was a puzzle. It disappeared for long periods of time. So the team went back to the videotapes of the exterior of the club, looking for any sort of lead. It was then that they made a dramatic breakthrough by watching the door next to the club.
And here's really the power of surveillance. All of a sudden, we started to figure out that there was a certain woman who would leave almost like clockwork when certain events took place.
Mao checked all their logs and realized that the woman left at the exact same time that Gotti's voice disappeared from the audio recordings. The FBI now discovered that there was an internal staircase leading from the club to the apartments above. And a background check on the tenants revealed why Gotti's voice was disappearing from their recordings.
Apartment 10 was occupied by the widow of a Gambino soldier by the name of Mike Sorelli. Gotti's minions would tell her, hey, we need to use your apartment for an hour or so. She'd go to the neighbor, watch TV. Gotti and his minions would go up there and have their administration meetings in her living room. So that was the break that we needed.
And I remember Bruce Mao calling me and saying we had the Eureka location.
But now, they were faced with a new problem. How to get into an apartment where somebody lived.
Whole nother ball game to get in there. Because you have a widow living there 24 hours, 7 days a week, and you have to get into her apartment.
Mao's team learned that Mrs. Sorelli will be going out of town for Thanksgiving. So in late November 1989, Kallström's team returned to Mulberry Street and placed a bug in her apartment.
And that's when the waiting started.
As weeks passed without results, Mao's team began to fear the worst. If Gotti suspected he had been bugged, the entire operation would be over.
You always wonder, did they discover something? Did they make the tech guys? Did they leave a little piece of wire behind? You know, has it been compromised?
Then, on a late November evening, the team observed Gotti and his henchmen enter the club, and they get ready to listen on the new bugs.
And sure enough, they opened the door for apartment number 10. And one thing we didn't know at the time was that John Gotti's deaf in one ear. So they couldn't whisper, they had to talk like we're talking now, and loud and clear.
And right there is our microphone.
You tell this punk, me, John Gambino, you're 7, you cocksucker.
John Gotti's voice was coming through loud and clear.
So here's Gotti, who warns everybody not to talk on the peril of death if they're ever picked up on eavesdropping. He goes up there and he's talking openly.
He would go over stuff over and over again.
Now listen to me, fella. Now listen. You're going. It's 7.
So it wasn't like, what did he say? If you didn't get it the first time, just wait a few minutes, you'd get it again.
John talks about whacking DB, Robert DiBernardo.
When DB got whacked, they told me a story. I was in jail. And I whacked him. I knew why it was being done. I done it anyway.
And John's classic line was, we're not sure he's a rat, but when in doubt, you kill him.
It was a clear admission to a murder.
It was what Mao had been waiting for several years. And Gotti handed it to him on a silver platter.
Where are we going?
All told, we monitored a total of 5 conversations, maybe 7.5 hours of tape all told. But they were like the top 40 hits.
And we knew we were off to the races. We knew we were going to have a really good case.
An hour from now, be it tonight, or 100 years from now, when I'm in jail, it's going to be arroz and orange.
On December the 11th, 1990, the FBI arrested John Gotti for the murders he had spoken of on the tapes. Along with his closest henchman, underboss Sammy Gravano. At the pre-trial hearing, Gotti, the seasoned pro, was apparently unconcerned.
Pretty good. You know they're going to try and keep you in jail. They say you're in danger.
At the time of his arrest, Gotti was his normal braggadocio self. He was cocky, confident, you know, smiling.
He didn't know what was coming. He didn't know those tapes were coming. And he sat down, we played part of the tapes, and he knew right away what we already knew, which was we had a great case. There was no longer a Mr. Cool sitting there. He was like a cornered animal, and I enjoyed every moment of it.
But before the trial even started, there would be one more twist. One of the FBI recordings had caught Gotti bad-mouthing his own underboss, Sammy Gravano, behind his back.
Sammy knew there was something bad in those tapes, not just for them getting convicted, but something bad in terms of his relationship with John Gotti. But he didn't know what it was.
Gravano now broke with Mafia law and approached the FBI without his boss's permission, demanding to hear the tapes.
Never forget as long as I live that, the playing of that December 12th tape in its entirety for Sammy.
It's basically an hour tirade against Sammy the Bull Gravano. He calls him the greed-eyed monster, how much he hates Sammy, thinks he's greedy. He talks about firing him.
Time I turn around, there's a little coffee pot.
More importantly, the recordings had Gotti accusing Gravano of several killings.
And every time we got a partner that don't agree with us, we kill him. He kills me, okay?
Gravano was just red. He just wanted to burst. He was ready to explode. He was so upset about his loyal, his wonderful boss just bad-mouthing behind his back.
Sammy's looking down at the transcript, and he takes his headphones and throws them down on the table and says, "Don't gloat, guys. Don't gloat."
And Gravano realized, why should I die in jail for a family I no longer believe in? I want to become a government witness.
At that moment, Gravano decided to break the Mafia's code of silence, the omerta, and turn against his boss and his entire Mafia family.
We never thought for a minute Sammy would flip. I thought John would flip before Sammy would flip. And I really didn't think there was any chance in the world that John would even think about flipping.
He told us about a lot of murders that he committed, which we didn't know about. I think there were a total of 19. He gave us more details as to the Castellano homicide, exactly how the whole thing went down. He was in the car with Gotti.
With Gravano on side, what had already been a strong case was now airtight. Outside the court, it was a typical Gotti circus. He was still, after all, the Teflon Don.
It's not just average guys caught up in the Gotti spectacle. A who's who from Hollywood came to Brooklyn to take in the show.
This is one of the great dramas that's going on today.
The trial was really high drama because it was like the #1 media event here in New York, so the reporters every day filled up half the courtroom. We all sat with Gotti's minions. And the highlight was when Gravano testified for 9 days.
Today, Gravano explained how the two men plotted the 1985 murder of then-boss Paul Castellano and his driver, Tommy Valachi. How they watched the hit go down outside a New York City steakhouse and then drove past the bullet-riddled bodies.
He didn't diminish his own criminality. He admitted to 16 murders. He admitted what he had to admit. He was a lights-out witness. I've been doing this now 27 years as a prosecutor and a judge. There was no better witness than Sammy Gravano. He killed them. And everybody in the courtroom knew that John Gotti was going to be convicted once Sammy Gravano testified, including John Gotti.
When the jury announced their verdict, Gotti's crew incited a riot outside the court.
I'm ashamed to say I'm an American in this country. That's what I'm ashamed of.
This is wrong what happened to him. What was he, a criminal?
Gotti had been found guilty on all charges in June 1992. Racketeering and 5 murders, including the Castellano hit.
It took the government 6 years to finally get the so-called Teflon Don, but this time it was the prosecution's turn to gloat. The legendary luck of John Gotti finally ran out.
The Teflon is gone, the Don is covered with Velcro, and every charge in the indictment stuck.
It was quite an occasion. And I still get emotional talking about it now.
For one member of the prosecution team in particular, it was a moment to be savored.
Come on.
You can imagine my feelings.
How does it feel to be the man who got Gotti?
Don't get him nervous now.
Well, this was my second trial. You know, I worked long and hard in that first case for a couple of years with a 7-month trial, only to have a juror get bought. We couldn't have been happier.
We were pleased. We were happy.
Are you smiling again?
Gotti was sentenced to life in jail, spending 23 hours of each day in solitary confinement. Gotti's indiscretions incriminated an entire tier of Gambino captains.
The FBI itself could not have handpicked a better candidate to be the head of one of the major mob families in New York than John Gotti.
Because of him, most of these captains were arrested, convicted, taken off the street. And they'd say, John and his friggin' big mouth, here I am. They hated this guy.
He was an absolute ruination for the Mafia. He was so inept, unqualified, and incompetent that he single-handedly wrecked the Gambino crime family.
John Gotti died in jail in 2002, age 61, after serving 10 years of his life sentence. To some New Yorkers, Gotti will always be a modern-day Robin Hood. But he was never anything more than a thug. His only legacy was the destruction of the most powerful Mafia family in history.
His legacy, just another boss who killed the previous boss, gets arrested, dies in jail. No more, no less.
August the 14th, 1981, New York City. Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, a captain in the Bonanno crime family, walks into the Motion Lounge Bar in Brooklyn. He hands the barman the keys to his apartment, a large bundle of cash, and the diamond-encrusted rings from his fingers. He tells the barman he's going to a meeting and doesn't know if he's coming back. He is driven across town to a house in Staten Island. The meeting is in the basement. Sonny Black was killed because he had brought a spy, Donnie Brasco, into the inner sanctum of the Mafia. He was really Special Agent Joe Pistone.
Did I want to see him get killed? No. Would I rather have him gone to jail? Yeah.
Thanks to Pistone's 6 years undercover, over 200 mobsters will be convicted. And one of the biggest Mafia families brought down. It was the most successful undercover operation in FBI history. But the operation that would one day bring down the Mafia would start on a far smaller scale. In 1976, New York was facing a wave of truck hijackings.
These loads were sometimes worth $200,000-$300,000. And the mob guys would hijack the truck, stick the truck up, take it, and then sell it to fences.
The FBI decided to initiate an undercover operation to target these fences in an effort to stem the flow of hijackings. They selected Joe Pistone for the operation. Pistone had racked up extensive undercover experience over his 15 years as an FBI agent.
I always worked undercover cases. I worked all criminal matters, bank robberies, prostitution cases, worked a lot of gambling cases.
Pistone had grown up in an Italian-American family in Paterson, New Jersey, and knew well the sort of people he might encounter undercover.
Growing up in a neighborhood, you always know who the mob guys are in a neighborhood, but, you know, my family's situation was, you know, you keep away from those guys, you know, don't get involved with them.
To get to the fences, the FBI created a cover for Pistone. A jewel thief.
We came up with burglar and jewel thief because when you're in an undercover situation, you can't become involved in any violence, crime or violence. So you come up with a legend that doesn't tend to lead toward violence. Not many jewel thieves in jail for murder, you know. So I went to school, learned all about jewelry, precious gems, the locks, alarms, safes. So we took about 6-7 months to prepare for this operation.
With his training complete, Pistone was ready to embark on his mission. In 1976, he left FBI headquarters with a new ID as Donnie Brasco, unaware he would not return for over 6 years. Now, his job was to find a way to infiltrate the hijackers.
You don't just walk into a place and say, hey, I'm Donnie Brasco, jewel thief, I want to start doing business with you. It doesn't work that way.
Pistone had moved from his home in New Jersey, leaving his wife and children behind, and rented an apartment in Manhattan.
The plan was we had certain bars and restaurants that we knew these guys hung out in. And the idea was for me to frequent these places and get my face seen, get known, and hopefully become engaged in conversation.
It would take many months until people trusted the new face as a local.
Well, the first 6 months I would just hit these different restaurants. Some were in the Upper East Side, some were down in Little Italy. I mean, they were basically all in Manhattan. I would just frequent, go in, sit at the bar, order a meal at the bar, order a drink at the bar, and just hang around for a couple hours. You can't form a pattern. You can't go into the same place the same day at the same time. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's not a 5-day-a-week job. It's a 7-day-a-week job.
For Pistone, it was slow and repetitive work.
Did I enjoy it? I endured it. I put it that way. I endured it. I'm not really a bar guy. I don't drink. I mean, you know, I'll drink one beer, maybe one glass of wine. I wasn't in love with being an undercover agent. To me, it was part of my job.
Finally, after 6 months of targeting the bars of Manhattan, Pistone thought that his face had become familiar enough, and he decided to try his luck with a barman whom he suspected had criminal connections.
I finally felt, well, I got to make a move here. Come in one night and, hey, Donnie, how you doing? Okay. We start talking, and I had a package of diamonds. And I said, I need X amount of money for these. Say $10,000. As an undercover, you got to know what the street price of stuff is we call swag. You know, the difference of buying these diamonds at Tiffany's than buying off somebody in the street. And he didn't say a word. He just picked it up, put it in his pocket.
Days passed, and despite regular visits back to the bar, the package was never mentioned by the barman or by the man he knew as Donnie Brasco. But a fortnight later, there's a breakthrough.
After about 2 weeks, I come in one night. He said, somebody left this for you. It's an envelope. I pick it up. And the money's in there.
It was the payment for the jewels. This was the first important step in establishing Pistone's credibility as the criminal Donnie Brasco.
Now he knows it, you know, I mean, I don't have to spell it out to him that I'm a jewel thief, you know? And it went from there.
Over the next few months, the barman started to invite Donnie out, introducing him to numerous contacts.
The places we went to were all after-hours joints, you know, gambling and after hours. And he would introduce me, you know, just as Donnie.
Pistone was being introduced as Donnie Brasco to all sorts of shadowy people. But one introduction in particular would become very significant. The man was known as Gilly, and was not only a fence and a truck hijacker, but was what the mob called a made guy.
Made, straightened out, good fellow, wise guy. All those terms mean the same thing. You've been officially inducted into a particular mafia family.
Now news that Pistone was directly involved with a made mafia member changed the entire nature of the operation. The FBI seized the opportunity and encouraged Pistone to get in with Gilly and his crew. Pistone used all that he had learned at the FBI to convince them that he was a jewel thief, but they wanted to see the spoils of his crimes.
You have to be an earner, you know. They're not taking me in because they like my looks, you know. You have to see that I have the ability to make money.
Suddenly, Pistone needed to get hold of a lot more jewelry from his supposed robberies.
In the operation as a jewel thief, I mean, I wasn't going out robbing Tiffany's to get the jewels. Any jewelry that I brought around came from the FBI. It was confiscated jewelry that we got from U.S. Customs. There was jewelry that was confiscated. Other times I would bring around watches.
As Pistone began handing over more and more jewelry, it seemed that he was convincing them that he was a genuine thief. But then, some of the gang members started asking for his help in their own robberies, breaking into homes, something he was reluctant to do as an FBI agent.
They'd ask me, can you get by this alarm? Can you get in, And a couple times I said, no, I can't bypass that alarm system. I can't get into this place. I can't do this safe. And they got mad.
Pistone was called to a meeting by Jilly at his club with two other gangsters, Frankie and Patsy.
They locked the door. Patsy puts his gun on the table and he said, Donnie, he said, unless you convince me that you're a really great jewel thief, he said, the only way you're going out of here is rolled up in that rug.
They began to question Pistone on every detail of his past.
Where you from? Who did you know? What'd you do?
The questioning continued for 5 hours. Eventually, Jilly, convinced by Pistone's performance, called a halt to the meeting. But then, as Frankie and Patsy were backing down, Pistone took a massive gamble to increase his credibility.
If somebody calls you out in the street, you gotta be mad. And the only thing they're gonna understand here is some kind of force. So I hit Frankie. Patsy jumps on me, he starts punching me, starts beating me. But I can't do anything because he's a made guy. You can't hit a made guy. That's a penalty of death. So I just keep hitting Frankie. Then finally they break it up.
The fight didn't just make him seem a credible gangster, but it also gave Pistone the excuse to distance himself from the increasing violence of Jilly's crew.
I went to Jilly and I said, Jilly, all due respect, but I don't want to be involved with these guys anymore. If they have something lined up, they have a score lined up, they have something they want to rob lined up, don't even tell me about it.
Believing Pistone was the real deal, Jilly introduced him to some major figures from another Mafia family, the Bananos. First, he met Tony Mira.
Tony Mira was a major drug dealer, one mean guy. He was the type of guy, he just abused everybody, but he made tons of money for the family through his drug dealings.
And Mira introduced him to Lefty Ruggiero, a hitman who had a reputed 23 killings to his name.
Lefty Ruggiero was what I would call 24-hour gangster. He was on being a gangster every minute of the day.
But Lefty Ruggiero had a trait that was invaluable for Pistone's operation.
He was a great historian as far as knowledge of the Mafia, how it worked and how it would work. And I gained a lot of valuable information from him.
Through Mira and Ruggiero, Pistone was able to shine a torch on the inner workings of a mafia family, something that the FBI, until then, had known surprisingly little about.
He could recount to us who was in, who was out. He could recount what rackets they were involved in. He could recount what's coming up in the future. The people he was involved in were particularly vicious. You know, who was going to kill who, or who was on the outs.
In 1978, the operation had a major breakthrough. Tony Mira was jailed for drug trafficking. And Lefty Ruggiero seized an opportunity to cash in on Pistone's skill as a good earner and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Pistone would operate exclusively under Lefty as his partner. He would now be much more closely involved in Bonanno family business. And critically, Lefty was part of a crew run by one of the most powerful captains in the Bonanno family, Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano.
Sonny Black was an effective, important leader, a capo. He had about 15 to 20 members in his crew, about 10 or 12 made guys, and probably at least 20 or 30 other known as associates or wannabes who hang around and work with the family. He dressed effectively like the consummate or quintessential mobster. T-shirts, dark suits, heavy on jewelry, rings, pinky rings, swaggered, talk tough.
Pistone was now hanging out daily with Sonny Black at his social club, the Motion Lounge in Brooklyn.
The average day in the life of a wise guy is not as exciting as you might think. You know, you might meet up at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. You hang out at the social club all day, and, you know, your conversation is about what you're going to rob, what you're going to steal, who's stealing from you, how much money you're making in this operation, how much money you're making in that operation. It's a steady grind every day.
Thanks to Pistone, the FBI were in a position they had never anticipated. They had an agent as an active member in a major crew in the New York Mafia.
There was a lot of excitement because up to this point, nobody had infiltrated to the point that they were running around with made guys in any family.
Pistone was now even better placed to gather material on a wide range of Mafia activities.
At this stage, I was gathering a lot of intelligence information, drug deals, extortion, hijacking, political corruption, politicians, law enforcement people that were corrupt. So it was a myriad of information.
But more than that, by working with Lefty, he was able to learn who the major players were in the Bonanno family and other New York families, giving the FBI names of captains and bosses.
I was finding out who the upper echelons, the structure of the family, who was basically running the family. So a lot of it had to do with intelligence information that we didn't know by doing investigations and that we weren't getting from informants. We showed we can go after and get the upper echelon versus, you know, versus the guys on the bottom doing all the dirty work.
Pistone's intelligence was helping the FBI build a much clearer picture of not just how the Bonanno family was run, but the whole Mafia. And what emerged was how much the various Mafia families were in fact cooperating with each other.
You came to realize that this was not a monolithic organization. These folks were working together. They might have been individual families that, you know, for work purposes and for power purposes, but in the scheme of things, they were working together, sharing these criminal activities.
And Pistone's success was not limited to just the Mafia in New York. With his strong credibility, he could now vouch for other undercover agents and instigate connections with other Mafia families, as far away as Los Angeles. In Milwaukee, he was so successful, he even managed to set up a face-to-face meeting with the mob boss there, the first time an FBI agent had sat down with such a high-ranking mobster. In Florida also, the FBI had been attempting to infiltrate the Mafia. They had set up a club, the King's Court, which they had hoped would be a beacon for Florida's mobsters. Pistone saw a way to help the operation by suggesting that Sonny Black become a partner in the club. The idea appealed to Sonny, and he sent Pistone and Lefty to Florida to check it out. Pistone now discovered that, like many city wise guys, Lefty had hardly ever left his New York borough.
Everybody thinks that mob guys are so worldly and they know everything. I mean, they're really parochial, and Lefty was no different. You know, had no idea how to make a plane reservation, you know, because a lot of time, most of the time, when they wanted to go somewhere, the plane tickets were, you know, back in the day before the computers, they were stolen, you know, from travel agents.
When Lefty saw the club, he reported favorably back to Sonny, and Sonny liked what he heard. But to operate in Florida, Sonny Black would still need the permission of the local Mafia, headed by Santo Trafficante.
That's when Sonny then starts moving ahead to get a meeting with Trafficante.
Sonny flew to Miami to meet the Florida boss to propose running illegal gambling operations together from the club. Trafficante agreed to the deal. It was a breathtaking achievement for the FBI.
Here we got two major bosses that we married up together to become involved in illegal activities with. I mean, unheard of. So that's, that was a big thing.
The FBI had the back office of the King's Court fully installed with microphones and cameras.
The King's Court was wired for audio and video, but it was only in the office, not the club, because the patrons were regular people who didn't know it was an FBI operation.
Pistone and other undercover agents started to stage drug deals with Mafia mobsters there.
What do you want your head, Tom? This I walk in the place in this town.
It was a gold mine of intelligence for the FBI. But for the Bananos, it was a major money-making operation. And Sonny Black loved it.
Every time you went to the club, it was packed. I mean, it was a big hit among the locals, you know, and everybody that was in there was a citizen, you know. So the club was making money. We're doing illegal gambling, casino nights, and illegal bingo games, which was big down there because of the elderly population. You can make a lot of money running bingo because they were taking the big cut for themselves.
Pistone was impressing Sonny Black, so much so that Sonny asked him to head up the operation in Florida. But more importantly for the FBI, in another promotion for Pistone, he no longer had to report to Lefty Ruggiero, but would answer directly to Sonny Black. Pistone now had access to one of the most important captains in the New York Mafia. Nothing like this had ever been done before. Now based in Florida, on trips back to New York, Pistone would even stay at Sonny's house, and they would spend hours feeding Sonny's racing pigeons on his roof.
I got to know Sonny Black pretty good, and Although he was a stone cold killer and a gangster, Sonny was the kind of guy you could spend time with. I mean, he would talk about the gambling, the drugs. He would talk about, who's the power in the family, all that. But you could also have other conversations with him. He loved those pigeons. Like I said, we'd go up every morning and he'd feed them and change their water and give me a history lessons on pigeons. I mean, I never listened to it, but I had told the FBI guys, when those pigeon coops come down, you can say goodbye to Sonny Black. He's gone.
Pistone's close relationship with Sonny Black now gave him even more access to information within the Mafia. He discovered that one faction of the Bonanno family, recent Sicilian immigrants known as Zips, were enormous drug importers. They used a series of pizza restaurants to distribute the drugs.
The Zips were Sicilians brought over to run the pizza shops that they had all over New York and Pennsylvania, not only to distribute the heroin, but to use these Zips for murders and anything else that they needed from them.
Based on Pistone's information, the FBI launched a major investigation into the Zips pizza restaurant drug trade. But they couldn't act on it immediately, because if Pistone's identity were revealed to the Mafia, he would be killed instantly.
Every day going to work like that, knowing he could easily be made or betrayed, and his life would have been worthless. And yet he did it for years.
As long as the person's undercover, you can't do anything with that information until they surface, or you jeopardize them.
But in fact, by now, there was a far more serious threat to Pistone's life. Tony Mira, Pistone's first contact in the Mafia, was released from jail and furious that Pistone was earning money from Sonny Black and Lefty. He wanted revenge.
What you have to remember, there's a lot of jealousy and envy in the mob. Mira gets out of jail and he's jealous because he thinks I'm making a lot of money and because I'm real close to Sonny Black. So he goes and he goes to his captain and says that I should be with him and not Lefty because he's the one that brought me around.
But Sonny, keen to keep his cut of Pistone's earnings, was reluctant to pass him back to Mira.
Mira goes to Sonny and Sonny says no.
Mira then took his complaint a stage further and called for the other capos to arbitrate the decision. Lefty and Sonny were called on to defend their claim on Pistone in a series of meetings. Lefty would phone Pistone after each one to let him know what was happening, and Pistone would secretly record their conversations.
Hey, Donnie, let me tell you something. I had a 4.5-hour meeting about you today.
For what?
Donnie, don't say for what.
Well, Left, you say don't say for what. How do I know? I don't even know what you're talking about.
I won you and I'm going to keep you.
Well, that's right.
All right, I'm not giving you up, and so is Sonny. We own Donnie, and we giving up Rocky. Now you give up my prick, I said. I won you. I'm not giving you up. I'll die with you.
Well, how does Sonny stand tonight with us?
Where does he stand? He's not giving you up. Not giving you up. Ain't nobody having you.
Hey, I don't want no part of Mira.
Sonny Black and Lefty won and got to keep Pistone as their own. But Mira wasn't finished yet, and in an act of revenge, he would do something that would instantly threaten Pistone's life.
So he figures, well, if I can't have him, nobody's going to have him. So then what Mira does is he puts in the beef with all the captains that I stole $250,000 in a drug deal. And, that's a no-no. You don't steal money from the family.
The severity of the accusations demanded a series of high-level meetings, or sit-downs. A sit-down was, in effect, a trial. High-ranking mobsters from the Bonanno family in New York, including some of the Sicilian Zips and Bonannos from far away as Canada, were called in to judge the accusations leveled at Pistone. If Pistone were found guilty, he would be executed immediately.
If you lose a sit-down, they're not gonna, you're gonna get killed right then. I mean, it's not like, you know, they're gonna give you, we're gonna give you a month to get your affairs in order.
Rocky admitted that you made $250,000.
Who did Rocky tell you?
After he murdered his men. Don't you understand?
He's a lying son of...
He's
a lying son of... He's lying, Left.
I don't give a fuck.
He's a liar. I'd never cut any junk money up with him.
Why don't fucking count?
Why does this guy want to, start...
He wants you bad.
So what do we do now?
I don't give a fuck, but you can't
I ain't afraid of anybody.
You can't help me out. I have to handle it. Without you.
But I ain't afraid of Mirror either. When's this thing all gonna end with this guy?
It ain't gonna end.
Sonny spent 3 hours fighting for Donnie. Eventually, his life was spared.
Sonny Black wins the sit-down.
Pistone may have survived the sit-down, but he had made a serious enemy of Tony Mirror. The FBI were concerned the operation was becoming too dangerous and began to consider pulling Pistone out.
They were talking about closing the operation down.
But Pistone thought otherwise and managed to convince his boss, Jules Bonavolonte, to continue just a little while longer.
I convinced Jules there's nothing to worry about, I mean, I can handle this.
By the end of 1980, FBI agent Joe Pistone had been undercover in the Mafia for nearly 5 years. His intelligence had been invaluable to the FBI. They had wiretaps on senior members of the New York Mafia, cases open on Sicilian heroin trafficking, the Milwaukee mob, and Colombian drug deals in Florida. And as a trusted confidant to one of the most powerful captains in the New York Mafia, the outlook for Pistone and the FBI was looking good. But soon, Pistone's operation was to become far more complicated. In Florida, a Las Vegas night was planned for the King's Court, an illegal gambling evening with craps, roulette wheels, and blackjack. The event was scheduled for January the 17th, 1981. Sonny and a number of New York wise guys had flown down for the event. The local sheriff had been paid to turn a blind eye.
I was right there when he paid the guy off. The guy assured us that everything was taken care of,
At first, the evening went well.
The place was mobbed. King's Court was mobbed, had all kind of money. We were making all kind of money.
But when the night was in full swing, something went terribly wrong. The club was raided by the local police. And Sonny, who refused to provide identification, was taken to jail. He was bailed the following day, but was furious.
Sonny spent the night in a can. He wasn't too happy the next day, believe me. He wasn't too happy the next day.
Sonny Black was convinced there must have been a rat. Pistone had to be concerned that suspicion might fall on him. But But as the crew flew back to New York, there was further cause for concern. Months earlier, in a move to impress his mob connections in Florida, Pistone had borrowed a luxury boat from the FBI for a fishing trip with Lefty. But now, Lefty spotted an article in a magazine detailing an FBI sting operation in which agents had posed as Arab sheikhs to entrap corrupt congressmen. The article included a picture of a boat used in the operation. It was the same boat that Pistone had used to impress Lefty Ruggiero.
The boat that we used was on the front page of Newsweek. There was another major undercover operation going called Abscam. It wasn't supposed to get the surface for a long time. But what happened was it got exposed.
Lefty demanded to know how Donnie had got hold of an FBI boat.
I told Lefty, remember this girl we met out in San Diego? And, you know, do you remember she said her brother had a boat in Miami and that we can use it any time? So I said, look, Left, I said, you were there, you know. Even if it is a government boat, they were after, you know, they're after the politicians. They weren't after us. They never came after us. So I got away with that one.
Lefty seemed to buy his story, but Pistone could not be sure he was still completely trusted by either Lefty or Sonny. But then any doubts he might have had disappeared when Pistone was given an astonishing vote of confidence from Sonny Black. Sonny Black proposed Pistone for full membership of the Mafia.
He had to go to every captain in the family and say, hey, I'm going to propose Donnie Brasco. You guys have anything against Donnie? And if one captain says a negative thing, they can't propose you. And all the other captains okayed it.
As a made man, it would be like a letter of introduction to some of the most powerful mobsters in America. Pistone would have much greater access to other parts of the Mafia and some of their most closely guarded secrets. But at FBI headquarters, there was real concern. It was all very well having an agent inside the Mafia, but having an agent inducted to a senior level could compromise the entire operation.
Theoretically, to become a member, you would have had to kill somebody. And their position was that even though he had not had to kill somebody, that would destroy his credibility before the courts.
And dramatic events within the Bonanno family power structure increased concerns in the FBI. The Bonanno family was in the midst of a civil war. And Sonny Black was right at the forefront of it. It had begun 2 years earlier, when Sonny Black had taken part in the murder of the boss of his own family, Carmine Galante. And now, Sonny was ordered to take out 3 rival capos. As the violence escalated, there was an increasing risk that Pistone could be killed in the crossfire.
Now that this war was going on, this is the first time everybody's carrying a gun now. Sonny Black gave me a gun to carry. Because guys that were with the other 3 captains were looking to kill us.
He was involved in some of the most vicious territorial wars that were going on in organized crime, so he was right there at the focus point.
And then, Sonny Black put Pistone in a position the FBI had been desperate to avoid. Sonny ordered Pistone to track down a rival mobster, Bruno Indelicato, and kill him.
So Sonny sends me to Florida because that's where they thought Bruno was. And the plan was if I found him, I'd call the FBI, they'd snatch him, we'd make it look like a hit, and then I can go back and say, you know, I took care of him.
But the FBI decided it was far too dangerous and ordered Pistone to pull out of the 6-year operation.
When we ended the operation, he was very upset because I'm sure he felt that if he could have been made, his credibility would have been enhanced.
Can you imagine the kick in the ass when it comes out, you know, Bonanno Mafia family makes undercover FBI agent? But I couldn't convince him, so we had to surface.
Two weeks later, with Pistone safely out of the way, Sonny was visited at his club by FBI agents. The agents presented a picture of the 3 of them with a 4th man, one of their most trusted crew members. You know this man as Donnie Brasco. He is, in fact, an FBI agent.
And Sonny said, well, if I see him around, then now I'll know. I mean, he really didn't believe it.
But eventually, Sonny Black began to accept the truth, and the FBI watched as he retreated to his pigeon coop to think over his options. He realized that if Donnie Brasco were an undercover agent, then, as the man responsible for bringing him into the Mafia, he was sure to be killed.
The FBI offered him protection. All he had to do was come forward. He said no. He knew what the results might be, but he wouldn't betray his oath. He decided to go down at the end, and he knew pretty much that he was on a hit list.
2 weeks later, Sonny Black was called to a meeting.
I didn't want to see him get killed, but, you know, he brought it upon himself. You know, when the agents went to talk to him, he could have easily called them later on and said, look, I'm coming in, you know. What kind of deal can I make? But he didn't. He was a real man and he was a real gangster. And that's how we left it. I said, you know, when you see those pigeon coops on the top of Sonny's apartment building getting torn down, he's dead. 17 days later, they start taking the pigeon coops down. That's when they killed him.
Sonny's body was found dumped in a New York river. Symbolically, his hands, which had welcomed an FBI agent into the Mafia, had been cut off. The mob now closed in on anyone who had been involved with Donnie Brasco.
They killed Sonny Black. They killed Tony Mira. They killed Jilly. Did I want to see him get killed? No. Would I rather have him gone to jail? Yeah. But it wasn't my doing, in my mind, that got him killed.
The FBI learned that Lefty Ruggiero had been summoned to a meeting where he would be murdered. They intercepted him and arrested him.
He thought it was a hit team, you know, because the agents were in surveillance clothes, just in, you know, nondescript cars. And he thought he was going to get clipped.
With Pistone now out of the firing range, the FBI used his information to go after hundreds of Mafia members.
4 years ago, a petty jewel thief known as Donnie Brasco began working his way up inside the mob. Last year, in a New York trial, Brasco unmasked himself. His real name? Joseph Pistone, undercover agent in the FBI.
I think I testified in about 17 different trials. We had 235 convictions. In New York, you know, we knocked out the Bonanno family to a great extent.
Bonanno family, as I know of it, I think they are nothing but a street gang at this point in time.
In Milwaukee, we took down the whole family. You know, the boss, the underboss, a couple of his captains. The same thing in Florida, you know.
A federal grand jury in Tampa today indicted Santo Traficante and 11 others on racketeering charges.
That include gambling, extortion, bribery, and narcotics.
In 1985, Pistone testified in the trial of the Sicilian heroin traffickers. Known as the Pizza Connection, it was one of the longest trials in American history.
All the principal defendants in this case were convicted. 18 of 19 defendants overall were convicted. It's an outstanding result. We couldn't have hoped for anything better. And it is a tremendous victory for the effort against the Mafia.
And in what became known as the Commission Trial, Pistone identified the heads of the New York families.
They're calling it the biggest sweep of underworld leadership in nearly 30 years. 5 reputed godfathers arrested and indicted in New York.
His evidence and testimony was central in securing convictions on 151 counts. Pistone's operation spelled the beginning of the end for the mob, as gangsters at all levels of the Mafia were sent to jail. Amongst them was Lefty Ruggiero, imprisoned for conspiring to murder the 3 capos, distributing drugs, extortion, bank robbery, and illegal gambling in Florida.
So he spent like 15 years in jail. I hate to be the guy that was his cellmate or guard, because he had to be the biggest pain in the arse there ever was.
The Mafia responded by placing a $500,000 bounty on Pistone's head. To this day, Agent Joseph Pistone lives under a pseudonym in an undisclosed location.